start by cutting the board to length. So I'm using the Raaghav saw, and this is some rough sawn reclaimed old Burmese teak, and there was a knot on this side. I think you can see it in camera, and I didn't want to deal with that, so I just cut it off. And then I used the shooting board to basically make the end square, and then I move on to flattening and removing the saw mark. So I used the low angle plane just to get it kind of flat, but then I was dealing with a lot of tear out. So a low angle plane actually is very prone to tear out, so I used the number 4 smoother. I didn't show that on camera, but I used that to remove all the tear out. And now I use a fret saw or a coping saw to basically cut the shape of the handle. You can do this with chisels also, but I actually did that later. I was facing a lot of trouble because the blade kept snapping, so I made a few relief cuts with the saw and followed the curves with the chisel. That actually works really well and leaves a much better surface because the wood is sheared and not cut. Now I am jointing the edges of this board because I want to glue on some strips to add some nice contrast. I use the low angle plane because it's got a long sole, that means it's a good jointing plane, and I set it to a fine cut so I don't get any tear out. I actually set it on a fine cut the time before to flatten it, but still I was getting a lot of tear out. But on the edges this worked fine, and I kept checking to make sure it was square, so the glue up was also square. Now I take a 35mm drill bit to drill a hole in the handle so it looks nice and like you can hang it. Here the board was actually bending a lot. You can see it was bending, so I don't want it to snap, so I moved it in so there was a lot less flex. And then I use a Forstner bit because it leaves a clean hole, and I just drill the hole with my power drill because my hand drill can't take such a big bit. This bit left a very clean surface and there was almost nothing to clean up. There was just a splinter on the bottom, but I didn't need to clean up anything more, so it worked really well. Now I'm using the Raaghav saw to rip the strips that I want to glue up. So this is also teak, but this is a different kind of teak. This is not reclaimed, so this is like an old growth, but it looked really nice and I thought it would make a good contrast, so I just rip it with the Raaghav saw and then joint the edges, and then it's ready to glue up. The Raaghav saw works really well because it doesn't have a spine, so there's like no depth to, like there's no limit to the depth it can cut. So I just make sure that I'm going slowly and keeping like on the line that I made with the marking gauge. And this is a 3/4 by 3/4 board, so I rip it to 3/8 by 3/8 because that's the thickness of the board that we made. Now I'm using the glue bot, which is a fancy kind of glue bottle, to apply glue on the sides of the board and on the strips that we're gonna glue on. I use a silicone brush to spread it, and then I will put on the strips, just let them tack up a bit, and then I can apply the clamps. So make sure you spread the glue properly and make sure that the strips are aligned properly, otherwise then it might not glue properly. And now F clamps are really helpful in this. Parallel clamps or bar clamps would be even better, but F clamps can work just fine. You just have to be very careful to set them up properly. And then I wipe away the glue bead that is squeezed out with a damp rag. I'm just using a carving gouge to add a little bit of texture around the handle and on the board. This is completely optional. This was just an aesthetic choice, like it's not necessary and it's not it doesn't serve any purpose, it just looks cool, I guess. You can find an affiliate link to all the tools that I'm using here, and it would help support my channel. You won't pay anything extra, but I would get a slight commission. So if you use the links, you would be supporting my work. Thank you. Now I'm doing something that is called or known as a water pop. So I'm running water all over the board, and this will cause the grain to rise. So you will notice after you've done the water pop and the board has dried properly, some fuzzy parts would have risen up, and this is actually the grain. So since this is a kitchen item and it's going to come in contact with wood, it's really essential to do this. So I run water all over my board, every part, and then just let it dry off. So I take a rag and dry it off. and basically after the board is dried off, the parts will rise up, like the grain will rise up, and then you can sand it off. So this is quite essential to make sure that none of these fuzzy parts get like they fall off the board and come into the food when you wash the board later, because you're going to wash this board later. So this is really essential to do, and it's an absolutely necessary step. So after the water pop is done, I'm going to start sanding. So I start off at 100 grit and then go to 150 grit. I don't think you need to start at 80 grit because you've already done a majority of the stock removal with a hand plane. But after 150 grit, I don't think it's necessary to go any higher. So I just use the sander to sand everything, make it level, remove any and especially to remove the fuzzy parts that come after a glue the water pop. And now I'm using an old hand plane blade. This actually has tungsten carbide brazed onto the end, so it makes a good scraper, and this is quite essential to scrape because the sawdust after sanding, most of it probably hasn't come off and it's stuck in the grain. So after doing this card scraper, you are basically removing any of the dust that is trapped. And here you can actually see the color difference. So after I scrape it and the dust is gone, you can actually see the grains start to come to life. So you can see the difference. Here I'm using this Moranive carving knife to basically add a chamfer around the handle. A carving knife like this one is really good because it can handle the curves well. You can use a chisel bevel down also, but I thought I would get more control with the carving knife, and I felt like I had much more control. You have to be really careful about the grain direction in these curves, so just go carefully and make sure you have a sharp knife, because otherwise it would be kind of tough to cut through the grain. And around the sides, like on the edges, I just use a block plane to add a chamfer, and I also add chamfers inside the hole that we drilled. So for the finish, I'm gonna apply cooking oil. It's really easy to apply and it's a food safe finish, which is really essential. So I just take on a generous amount and rub it onto the board. Make sure to cover every part. Let it soak in for an hour or two, and then I just wipe off the excess. It's really easy to apply and brings out the grain of the wood really nicely.